to Country by Wurundjeri Elder Uncle Ringo Terry. 1 minute. In the meantime, I can go over some housekeeping. Toilets are on levels 3 and 4. So I think up and down, and there's stairs and lifts that goes to these out from the foyer. And the morning tea and lunch will be out in the foyer as well. Tea and coffee is available throughout the day, so please help yourselves. And you can leave the building at any time for fresh air and you'll be able to get back in. The Wi-Fi is, the guest code is up on the screen there. If you select RMIT guest, this will take you to a login page where you click event and enter the code, plus some individual details. So that Wi-Fi code is 664175. And if you are posting today on the symposium on social media, we encourage you to use the official hashtag for Social Sciences Week, which is hashtag SSW2024. However, please be mindful of turning your distracting devices down to silent and be present throughout the day. We have a big program today. There's going to be a lot of conversations. We're going to be listening to a lot of experiences and stories. And afterwards, we have booked a space at Captain Melville on 34 Franklin Street for us to gather again after anyone that wants to come for this self-funded event. I'll just check. Hello.
First. Good. Now that you know who I am, let's have a beautiful, where are those flowers? Have I got those? Now, I'm taking my place in this land. Do you understand me? Yeah? Good. I'm 60. I was born in 1964 when the Beatles come to bloody Melbourne. That's how I got that bloody name Ringo, okay? Good. There we are. That's it. So here we are. Kicked around the institutions all me friggin' alive. And I won't go into those details because you might not be able to handle it like I can these days. The mental torture of it all. Yeah, I'm a bit pissed off. I'll articulate that, right? Closing the gap. Filthy rich off the misery of my people. Sick of it. You got me? Good. Yeah. Take a moment to sink that in. Where's that water, please? And the flowers. Now, I've got your attention. I've been hanging around Robbie Thorpe for too long lately. He's been schooling me on a lot of stuff. I've been hanging around with the right elders on this land. There's a bit of a push going on for all this interim government crap, but it's real. And I'm copping it from all fronts because I've decided to be the one to stand up and confront all this. Okay? So they're saying to me, Ringo, where does Melbourne stand? I just got a phone call then and I told him to shove his phone up his ass. Melbourne's on pause with all this shit until I sort it out, right? Good. We're not going to be pushed around by the 10 embassy or that mob and use Robbie Thorpe as their pawn. He's one of my best friends. I won't allow that crap either. Do you understand me? Do you understand me? Good. Now, Camp Sovereignty is going to be built whether it kills me or not. In my mind, it's as simple as changing the name. How we stereotype crap these days. You just call it Bungel's fire. Softens the blow. You understand what I'm saying? The mentality and the psychology of all this colonisation crap. Do you understand me? Finally, I want to know that you hear me. Yeah? Good. Have it do. Watch break 'em around like I did this morning. Understand the nature of what's still happening here. Okay? So many other Commonwealth nations that have long, deep stories to tell. You know, they massacred the occupants of those lands. We weren't the only ones, but it weren't that long ago. We're smart, intelligent people, folks, living on the most amazing, most privileged bit of real estate on the planet. We're playing games with each other still. My people don't even have a plot of land to grow a crop on. I want to swear, but I won't. Disgusted. I've seen in my lifetime, 60 years of age, this war in the Middle East coming to its fruition. All my life. Yes, Arafat, all them people. I've seen it all. Vietnam War. This war, this invisible war between blacks and whites in this country. Yeah, the spiritual war that's happening between blacks and blacks because of whites. Good. Glad you understand what I'm talking about. Holding the foot on that crap as well. I'm going to put forward the proposal soon, but there's a bit of a conflict going on, like there always is when big money changes hands in this city. I've seen all that crap all my life. The BLF. I was in jail with Naarm Gallagher, and I was in Parkville with all them killers from Wall Street. Chopper. I'm a gangster. I'm a peaceful one these days. All right, Harley, everyone knows that. I left that motorbike club because they've got disgusting behaviours. And so are people in this town. A behaviour type of people is what it's all about. Behaviour type, trauma type. You've got me? Do you get me? The behaviour type is recognised by intense cognitive behavioural therapy, which I've had to undertake to get an understanding of all this crap. Do you understand me? Good. I've got my eye on all this. You better start standing up for us. But don't ever talk to me again. Don't come up and say, hello, Uncle Ringo, because I remember who you are. I remember what you said to me today. I'm holding him to account as well. Good. Kummargii, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Uncle Ringo, for that very strong and direct welcome to country. Hi, everyone. My name is Lucky Sideris, and I'm the Head of Product at Informit. It's great to see you all here. at the 2024 Kummargii Yulendji Symposium. 1 year ago, Informit and CAVAL co-hosted the inaugural symposium with the aim of bringing together experts from the library, academic and publishing sectors to discuss how we describe, apply and amplify Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander publications. It was recognised that the academic publication space has expanded in exciting Indigenous ways since current indexing methodologies were implemented. We realised that many organisations within these sectors were starting to address inadequacies in these methodologies. Kummargii Yulendji Symposium aimed to bring industry and academic leaders together to present current projects in the ways we describe and organise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander academic outputs and approaches to decolonise these practices. The symposium was named by Boonwurrung Elder, now with Professor Carolyn Briggs. Kummargii Yulendji means knowledge is rising, and indeed Indigenous knowledge have continued to rise. There have been some significant progress in many important groundbreaking projects underway in this space. Alongside this positive momentum, we acknowledge the challenging time it's been and continues to be for First Nations people following the Voice referendum. In this political context, post-referendum, Informit reaffirms our commitment to amplifying Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voices, combating misinformation, embedding Indigenous perspectives and knowledges in our platform, and offering resources and spaces for productive critical discourse on First Nations issues. Today we will hear from some of the change makers at the forefront of this movement, opening with Tui Raven, who has authored the guidelines for First Nations collection description. We will then hear presentations and panel discussions from sector leaders from across Australia and conclude with keynote by Professor Hemi Wanga from Aotearoa in New Zealand. We are thrilled to be back and upscale. So this is an amazing space from those who were compared to what we were. Last year was pretty good too, but this is pretty amazing. And we wish to continue to offer a forum for this rising momentum. And this year we'll also intend to produce a publication of the proceedings of the symposium. But for now, I extend a very warm welcome to all the fabulous presenters and delegates. Thank you for being here to continue this vital and timely work. And I will hand over to Jem McCowan from CAVAL to say a few words and introduce the first speaker. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucky. I don't really have much to say except for we're delighted to be co-convening the Kummargii Yulendji Symposium with Informit again. As I said before, we have a very full agenda. I do want to mention a colleague, Anthony McLaughlin from Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, IATSIS, who played a vital role on a panel at last year's symposium with our keynote Tui Raven and Michelle Ruziniak. I want to mention Anthony, who passed away earlier this year. His unwavering commitment and dedication to his work, his extensive knowledge and his energy and humor will be missed today and into the future. We really appreciate the work Anthony did, and through Anthony, CAVAL and our members received training on the IATSIS subject and place thesauruses, as well as IATSIS pathways and AUSTLANG. This was conducted by Jamie Solomons, and we are pleased that some of Anthony's IATSIS colleagues are able to join us online today. CAVAL is here to support members, partners, and colleagues in sharing their experiences today. So there's a lot to get through. It's an important day. We appreciate all the speakers that have come, all the participants and presenters, and everyone that's contributing to today. So with that, it is now my great pleasure to welcome to the stage Tui Raven as our first keynote speaker. Tui's presentation is titled Redefining Academia, Indigenous Knowledges in Research and Higher Education. Tui is Yamaji and Nunga. She is the Senior Manager of Indigenous Programs at Deakin University Library and author of the Guidelines for First Nation Collection Description. The guidelines are intended to aid libraries and archives in better incorporating Indigenous knowledge systems into description practices. Tui is also a curator and researcher and works on documentaries. From 2020 to 2023, she was an associate producer for WA Content and on-screen investigator for the first Inventors documentary series on SBS and Channel 10. welcome Tui.
Kaya and Wonju. So Kaya is hi and Wonju is welcome in Noongar. So obviously before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we are meeting on Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung country, land of the Kulin Nation people. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I reconfirm my commitment to working with traditional owner groups within Victoria and the rest of Australia. Also, particularly in my role at Deakin, I also work with Wadawurrung traditional owners and in the process of working on partnership agreements with Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung and Eastern Maar. So, a bit about myself. Thanks for the introduction. So I'm what can be described as five generations, I get that right, 5 generations stolen. So what that looks like is my siblings, my mum and my grandmother are stolen. So Julia was my grandmother, Mary Mercy is my great-grandmother, and Julia is also my great-grandmother by 3, and they were all stolen. And then Nancy, who's my 4 times grandmother, I always get that wrong. She wasn't removed, but obviously she lived under the oppressive regimes. So I don't know if you were counting, that is 6 generations. I'm not stolen, but my siblings are. They're only about 10 years older than me. And you would have also noticed that my family is matrilineal. So I know that this symposium aims to describe how we describe and organise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander academic outputs and approaches to decolonise the systems. I'll be looking more at what the systems are in relation to higher education and the opportunities and challenges that we face in relation to valuing Indigenous knowledges and encourage more Indigenous leadership in the space and self-determination. So obviously some changes are required for institutions to fully comprehend their colonial legacies, and we are working quite hard at that, and to shift practices to be inclusive. I will talk about how individual and institutional cultural competencies impact how successful our higher education institutions are at embedding Indigenous knowledges and considering how we do that work. A bit of a word of warning, I probably have far too many slides, and I did actually try to pare it back, but I trust you, it's all in a good spot. I may switch between use of Indigenous, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander or First Nations. I'm off my time, so I say Indigenous to be inclusive of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. There may be instances where I use First Nations, so just bear with me, we use all these different languages. So I'm the author of the Guidelines of First Nation Collection Description, just making sure I've got it right. Obviously, I'd like to acknowledge the amazing work and support of Phoebe Weston Evans, who's the Senior Research Coordinator at ALIA, Trish Hepworth, the Deputy CEO at ALIA, Sarah Davidson, Member Services Coordinator at CAVAL, Michaela Goodwin at the National Library of Australia, Barbara Lemon at the National Library of Australia, Katja Henry, who was at CALL, all the members of the working group and the Indigenous Advisory Group who committed and helped with the guidelines. And as I said, a very, very special thank you to Anthony, and I don't want to cry here, to our comrade and colleague who I feel extremely lost without him. He was just an absolute powerhouse and he is sorely missed within the industry. So the guidelines, and this is a direct quote from the guidelines document. The guidelines are intended for a broad range of staff who work in libraries and archives and may include volunteers, client services, metadata specialists, archivists, record managers, librarians and digital services. The guidelines are to assist libraries and archives as they transform their approaches towards creating reparative descriptions for materials created by or containing information about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and communities. These materials encompassing cultural heritage and historical information are commonly known as First Nations collections. The objective is to facilitate a shift in practice in relation to things like historical bias and ensuring more equitable representations of First Nations people and communities. So during the research project, it became evident that this was a mammoth task. Why would I attempt something like this? So I worked in the glamour sector. I've worked in a couple of different areas in museums, libraries, art galleries. I haven't done any of the archives yet, so maybe that's my next step. So when I worked within these spaces, I got really frustrated at the fact we couldn't find stuff about ourselves. So if your cultural heritage is hidden in an explorer's diary or held in a box labelled after an archaeologist, an anthropologist or a social researcher, how would you find it? Or if your culture heritage could be defined in a narrow scope, why would you want your information held in an institution? And that's very important. Indigenous communities often may want their stuff held in institutions for safekeeping, and also include born digital within these questions. So the guidelines recommended considering reparative description in terms of Indigenous cultural and intellectual property rights. And that was very deliberate as cataloguers, and I know people hate me using that phrase, but I use it because the general public understands what that means. Or those people who describe records and metadata specialists already work within defined parameters of intellectual property rights and copyright law. So it was an opportunity to consider the way we describe materials. We often have to add things like date, author and title as minimum requirements under IP laws. We don't have ICIP laws yet, although we're hoping to have that in place. But it is a rights-based approach to considering Indigenous knowledge systems. It's not the only way we consider it, it's one way of considering Indigenous knowledge systems. And the panel discussion today from the Reparative Description Community of Practice will be a discussion about where the guidelines have been, or how we're using them since they've been published. So the consideration in writing the guidelines were in a sense simple in comparison to considering Indigenous knowledge systems within higher education. Universities were established primarily to serve as centres for higher learning, research and preservation and dissemination of knowledge. However, up until our recent past, these spheres of knowledge have been narrowly defined. The Australian Universities Accord, in the final report released on the 25th of February 2024, has quite significantly called out the need to include more First Nations knowledges and people within higher education. And it's made several recommendations. This is obviously more than this, and had several findings relating to First Nations people. So the importance of First Nations participation and leadership, valuing and supporting First Nations knowledge and research, and First Nations self-determination. I wanted to discuss the opportunities and challenges in relation to each of these. So in the final report, First Nations participation is considered an important pathway to success, and weaving Indigenous knowledges through education is also seen as essential to Australian society. As an Indigenous employee who has now worked at 3 universities, my story is not dissimilar to other Indigenous staff. There are a few of us, and we're spread widely across the university. While it is great to see the considerations of workforce pipelines, universities ought to consider the extra colonial load and emotional toll that Indigenous staff endure. I think non-Indigenous people don't understand the considerable amount of masking that I have to do to work in this space. I know this because when I work in spaces with other Indigenous colleagues, I find myself saying things to them like, is that a Wadjula thing? So Wadjula, where I come from, means white person. Or is that just my personality or my personal preference? So I have to actually check in with my Indigenous colleagues to see whether I'm just reading it wrong or it's a personal thing. Often it's not a personal thing, it's a cultural thing. Then I have to decide whether to do some cultural translation or decide that it's not worth it to unload and pack it for staff or to the executive or the institution as a whole. And we often have these conversations where we can see that there are huge systemic issues for Indigenous people, but we have to weigh up the emotional toll, the colonial load, and whether or not we listen to at the executive level. Workplace representation obviously needs to be improved. There is an exception that there's an expectation that as an Indigenous staff member, you take on extra work related to Indigenous issues, even if it's outside our area of expertise. So this adds to extra workloads and stress. The thing is, Indigenous people, we don't often say no, and it's a cultural thing for us because we're representatives of our community. So if there's a downright no, I have to think to myself, oh, would my mum or my aunties or my uncles approve of me saying no, and is it going to get back to them? So we often tend to just do things when we're asked because we've got this little cultural thing going on in the background, and I don't think people realise that, which is why a lot of us put in all the extra work. Also, those seeking advice have often shopped around the university, and this happens a lot. So someone will come to you and say, oh, so-and-so told me to come to you to talk about this, and you have a conversation that lasts an hour or sometimes more. And then I don't think people realise what the black vine is like, so we call that the black grapevine. We all talk to each other. Sometimes we find out that someone has shopped around to 6 staff. They've spent 6 to 10 hours trying to get the same answer. So it's absolutely an emotional load, not just for one of us, but everyone in our network, because we've all had to come together and go, well, if we've all given the same advice, why are they still shopping around? So looking for the next answer until they get the right one to go back to their manager or whatever the decision they want to make. Another point is that it's a small percentage of staff at the university, so 1.4% to basically assist, and it may be less than 1.4%, as some staff are in roles that don't or can't provide these services. This is incredibly important to consider in the context of universities attempting to embed Indigenous knowledges into course curricula. University Australia, in its Indigenous employment guidelines, point out the importance of cultural strategies to ensure that Indigenous employees feel safe, our cultural protocols are observed, whether cultural safety is practiced within the workplace. And importantly, understanding if employees feel they understand the key elements of Indigenous history and culturally significant practices. I'm incredibly lucky to work at Deakin Library under the leadership of Hero MacDonald, the university librarian. So every year we have 25 to 30 staff who undergo the IATS's core cultural learning, and I lead discussions to unpack the learnings. And I think that's really important. You can do this training, but until you've got someone to actually talk you through and how to actually translate that into your work practices, it may just go over your head. So I believe the majority of staff at the library are culturally sensitive and responsive, and they have high levels of cultural intelligence. This is mainly due to things like critical librarianship and understanding that the resources we collect may not represent or support our communities. And we do the work to make our spaces safe and equitable. However, my role is also not without its challenges. While I can confidently state that the staff at the library are culturally competent and way more aware than the average Aussie, can I say the same for the rest of the university sector? This is important to consider in valuing and supporting First Nations knowledge and research. Universities Australia Indigenous Strategy for 2022 to 2025 points out the importance of combating racism, providing cultural safety, recognising the value Indigenous people and knowledges bring to the university, and embedding Indigenous value systems and knowledges into the university structure. So Indigenous focused strategies and policies like Indigenous research strategies or cultural capability frameworks are incredibly important for providing this direction. And just to name a few that are obviously we probably know about them, University of Sydney's Narrogin, we learn, think and listen together. It's a research strategy. UTS has the Indigenous Education and Research Strategy. University of Queensland's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Research and Innovation Strategy. University of Newcastle, the Cultural Capability Framework, and Curtin University has an Indigenous Cultural Capability Framework. There's way more than that out there. For institutions without cultural capabilities frameworks or Indigenous research strategies, Indigenous students, staff and researchers have little support in feeling valued and supported. Why? It's for two main reasons. I'm sure there's more, but I just gave two. Indigenous people often have to explain in further detail what is important for us, and other Indigenous peoples as well, and the particular context to include Indigenous knowledges. Indigenous knowledges may be included in ways that are either culturally insensitive or just downright wrong. And the second point is we're also often tasked with testing the boundaries of what is permissible. It is only then that we are either told it's wrong or we have to write the rules as we go. And trust me, as an undergrad person who actually did their honours, we actually had to write the rules as we went, which is actually really interesting. So there's two points that are particularly important for ethical research. The IATS's guidelines for ethical research, through its 14 principles, outline what to happen, and this is a quote from IATS's. It is essential that Indigenous people are full participants in research projects that concern them, sharing an understanding of the aims and methods of the research and share the results of this work. At every stage, research with and about Indigenous peoples must be founded on the process of meaningful engagement and reciprocity between the researcher and Indigenous people. It should also be recognised that there is no sharp distinction between researchers and Indigenous people. Indigenous people are also researchers, and all participants must be regarded as equal partners in research agreements. I think we really do forget that the distinction between researcher and participant for Indigenous people is quite blurred. The questions in many ethics applications are still written in ways where First Nations people are viewed as the subject of the research. For example, in a standard ethics application, you're informed to have a list of questions written out with flyers and information sheets for the participants. However, this is not how we do things in Indigenous culture. We listen and talk, and we also nurture our relationships. And through this, we get relationality, which is also very important for us. Then we're led by our elders, and if our questions are going in the right direction. Through this process, we further build reciprocity. It is difficult to see how the university ethics process aligns with the ethics process for me and my community. I can tell you from experience, it doesn't really at all. Sometimes Indigenous researchers are forced to endure more work and jump more hurdles just to get ethics approval, which looks like extra updates to ethics committees as we ensure the right people are part of the conversation and research, extra agreements to ensure that Indigenous data is protected, and really considering how Indigenous cultural protocols should be considered in research. These impactful transformative outcomes, and that's from the Accord, may require institutions to take some radical approaches. Cultural capability frameworks are incredibly important to successfully embed Indigenous knowledges into curricula, because frameworks like this focus our attention on increasing cultural responsiveness and proficiency. Or to put it another way, move people and institutional structures from culturally ignorant or neglectful through to culturally proficient or intelligent. So many of us here would know about William Hovell's 4 levels of intercultural communication, or the hierarchy of competence, sorry. So basically from wrong intuition, my apologies, to right intuition. How do we shift people from one end of the spectrum or from the bottom of this pyramid to the top? So William Taylor, who's chair of the Department of Homeopathic Medicine and National College of Natural Medicine in Portland, Oregon, states that it's more a 5-step process. This makes sense when we consider everything that we know. So basically he describes it as repeatedly, continuously rediscovering a beginner's mind. So we work our way through these areas and we understand at some point we might have to come back to the beginning. In a short video for cultural synergies, my apologies. So Taylor's 5-stage model is incredibly important for understanding reflective practice in learning. Dr. Tom Verghese, in a sense, takes one step further and considers the type of questions we ought to be asking ourselves. So in a short video from Cultural Synergies, he describes the four key components of cultural intelligence: drive, our underlying motivations; strategy or metacognition, the ability to think about thinking. How do I frame this response? Knowledge, what information do I need about a particular country, or in our instance, culture? And skills or behavioural, how do I practice this? So sometimes with our cultural awareness training, we fail to understand the complexity of the individual, the organisation, institution or company someone works for, their social groups and society, especially when considering our underlying drive. So I'll use self-efficacy as an example. Self-efficacy as a concept introduced by psychologist Albert Bandura and refers to an individual's belief in their capacity to execute behaviours necessary to produce specific performance outcomes. It's the confidence in one's ability to influence events and have control over one's environment. I can cite my very own struggle with using inclusive language. I believe it is powerful and we should use it at all instances when someone has identified their preference. I have the knowledge. I do believe gender identity exists on a spectrum or is fluid. I'm aware of this from the people I know, but I'm let down by my speech acts and unfortunately my own drive. So why my drive? I come from a very sexist and racist state and city. So I'm just going to say it, Western Australia is very much like that. The use of particular pronouns is outright ostracised. So by default, my self-efficacy motivation is wired for me to fit into society. So I stick to the duality of gender norms, at least in speech acts. It's not like that in my brain, but the speech acts actually is what is betraying me. So unless I address these underlying drivers, I'm always going to let down others with my speech acts, regardless of how I think or feel inside of me. Something similar can be said when we're looking at wanting to include Indigenous knowledges and systems into the everyday life of Australians. There are some underlying blockers. We could say that for some members of society, their motivation or underlying drive is to fit in. In some aspects of life, Indigenous knowledges is still very much an outsider perspective. where we will, to paraphrase African-American black activists, yell, scream or raise our voices to be heard from the margins. Now imagine for a moment this cultural intelligence diagram. Now think about applying it at an institutional level or a student cohort level. In this context, what we are asking of our staff and students, do our institutions have the ability to understand, in the words of Verghese, consider the underlying motivations, think about thinking, how does this response need to be framed, consider the information relevant to a particular country or culture, and how does our organisation need to practice this? They're also the most important questions that I ask myself in my role. At Deakin Library, we're also involved in assisting to embed Indigenous knowledges into curricula, but the way we do it is very different to, say, a unit chair or a course coordinator. In a sense, they use a microscope, and at the library, we just use a very large magnifying glass. We tested use of the Indigenous Knowledges Attribution Toolkit contained in the Indigenous Referencing Guidance for Indigenous Knowledges. This was published by the Indigenous Archive Collective, Jumbani Institute and CAVAL. So the Indigenous Knowledges Attribution Toolkit, or ICAT for short, enables opportunities for students to critically analyse sources, respect Indigenous knowledge authority, support the reclamation of Indigenous knowledges, and enable students to understand their own positionality in relation to knowledges. And students should be able to confidently draw on and attribute Indigenous knowledges. The ICAT asks undergraduate students to consider these two things basically. It's authorship and content. In terms of authorship, is the author First Nations, or are they working with others who are community-based participants or First Nations? And what is the author's relationship to the knowledge? And all of this in the context of content. Does the source use outdated terminology? Is it a contemporary source? Was the information in the source gathered with informed consent? And does the source centre Indigenous ways of doing and knowing? So what the referencing essentially looks like, it'll be one of three things. So it'll be Indigenous authored or co-authored publications that include country language affiliations, Indigenous knowledges cited in Indigenous authored or co-authored publications, or Indigenous knowledge is cited in non-Indigenous authored publications. So the library chose this tool to basically push and back quite hardly because it enables students to embed Indigenous knowledges themselves. So they have to do the research, they have to find for themselves what this looks like. This toolkit enables students to start to understand the diversity of Indigenous groups, nations and languages in Australia, something they wouldn't otherwise use. It also enables students and staff an insight into the complexity of how Indigenous knowledges have been recorded and when it is essential to quote First Nations authors talking about Indigenous knowledges or about their own nation, country or language. So testing was incredibly insightful. We tested with a number of different cohorts across the university, some Indigenous units, some non-Indigenous units, some that were quite advanced and teaching embedded stuff and others that weren't. It showed a huge gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous staff and student using the resources. So this might be for several reasons. So for Indigenous people, we state our mob, country, nation or language when we meet others. So maybe for us, having to include this in referencing just seems so natural. Indigenous people are not so concerned with the order. So that was one of the questions that we had coming up. Which is the right order? Is it nation, country, language, or does it have to be in any of those? And they often don't know the difference. This is self-determined by Indigenous people and their families. However, non-Indigenous staff and students, they often ask the order, and the advice I gave was to write it as written by the First Nations author or written within the text. You'll get to understand the nuances the more you do research in Indigenous, looking at Indigenous publications, where you can be like, oh, they said it like this before, maybe they found out more information, or it's just a preference now. So what is the difference between nation, country and language? So we demonstrated this to students by advising them to use the AATSIS language thesaurus, so the AUSTLANG, to give students a sense of the difference between language and nation, and to look out for things like, you know, Koori with an I or an IE. Can't remember, one's New South Wales and one's Victorian. I can remember the difference. But that's not a language, and that's probably more a group, and you won't find that in the AUSTLANG, so it's definitely not a language. And so the students had to figure out for themselves which was which and which order to put it in. So obviously we can't give students all the answers, as it's about learning a new skill, or several in fact. a new way of referencing and a new way of learning about Indigenous communities, languages, nations and knowledges. So the second way I assist with embedding Indigenous knowledges is through advice. The first thing I ask is, what exactly are you trying to achieve? Is it to celebrate Indigenous culture? Sometimes people get stuck merely wanting to celebrate Indigenous culture without interrogating whether this is appropriate. Better ways of understanding would be to understand the context of Australian history and our Indigenous cultures, or learn from traditional owners. Then I might provide a plan. An example that I often use is, we live and breathe on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander country, sea and waterways. A lot of the things we know we take for granted. There's a lot of information already in the public domain that we either ignore or do not attribute to Indigenous authors or peoples. For example, Indigenous peoples have detailed knowledge of acacia plants, including medicinal and food uses, and other uses like chewing tobacco or creating weapons or cultural objects. Most of this information can be found online and in many instances is recorded in the Atlas of Living Australia, another great resource to use in teaching and professional learning. This type of activity, like the use of the ICAT, is an attempt to rewire our brains to view Australia through an Indigenous lens. It's always been here, but our glasses have been smudged. So I'll say that again. It's an attempt to rewire our brains to view Australia through an Indigenous lens. It's always been here, but our glasses have been smudged. The self-determination is also incredibly important in bringing Indigenous knowledges to the forefront. The Accord in Recommendation 34 highlights the need for a First Nations-led review, and then again in the findings, and in Chapter 6, it mentions First Nations Council being responsible for advising ministers and the Australian Tertiary Education Commission. Before we consider what self-determination in higher education looks like, let's take a step back and consider what self-determination is. In the Australian Human Rights Commission Declaration Dialogue Series Paper number 2, self-determination, it states, achieving self-determination for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of Australia would involve a redistribution of power to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are the key decision makers in our own lives. Further, the paper states, the exercise of self-determination for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples is central to the achievement of a number of goals and objectives. I'd like to call out, and I haven't put them up here, there's a few of them, but our customary laws, being subject to our own laws, community self-governance, our own schools as also being very important in the higher education system. So I don't know if anyone saw ABC online last week, but on the 8th of September there was an article titled, Indigenous leaders have long called self-determination the key to closing the gap. But what does that mean? So I don't know if anyone knows how long the Closing the Gap's been going on, but basically it was sort of introduced, the first steps of it were introduced in 2005 when the Social Justice Report was released by Professor Tom Karma, who was the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner. In 2007, COAG, or the Council of Australian Governments, pledged to lose key gaps in life expectancy, halve the gap in mortality rates for children, halve the gap in reading, writing and numeracy achievements within a decade. That was in 2007. In 2008, COAG approved the National Indigenous Reform Agreement, which set out closing the gap targets. So basically, it was going to help to achieve these goals. COAG identified a number of building blocks: early childhood, schooling, health, economic participation, healthy homes, safe communities, and governance and leadership. So as pointed out in the ABC article, only 5 of those 19 targets are on track and 5 are widening. Those on track relate to birth rates, preschool enrolment, overall employment, with slight improvements in life expectancy, Year 12 completion and housing. And those widening relate to out-of-home care, Indigenous people in the justice system and rates of suicide. When you're far more likely to be taken, go to prison or take your own life, what incentives do you have to pull yourself up by your bootstraps and just give it a go? When you're less likely to see an Indigenous person as a chief scientist or a surgeon or a leader, what incentive is there for you to engage in education beyond Year 12? What has the government done to shift barriers to equity and equality? The Closing the Gap policy is over 15 years now it's been in place. Has promised some watered-down versions of saving Indigenous peoples as administered through governments who are obviously ignoring self-determination. And I think that's one of the biggest points about what COAG decided on. It promises self-determination, but it doesn't give it. That's not to say that closing the gap policy was all bad. There's been some movements, but it's from the early 2000s. It's time for a change. We need a real proper think about this in this space. The article obviously focuses on Victoria and the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria, with the co-chair of the Assembly, Ruben Berg, describes self-determination as not only the destination, but also how we get there. There was a view in the article that many traditional owners want greater control of the way languages, culture and land is protected. And the key to self-determination is who holds the power structures and who gets to exercise autonomy. And under COAG and closing the gap, we don't actually get to exercise any of that control or have autonomy. Ruben further pointed out, we want to be part of making those decisions, not having stuff forced upon us, as has sadly happened so much. There are several challenges related to including Indigenous knowledges and self-determination in higher education and research. Obviously, the big one is cultural misalignment. So many academic frameworks and research methodologies are rooted in Eurocentric or Western perspectives that may not align with or fully respect First Nations ways of knowing and governance systems. The human research ethics process, which I mentioned before, is another key example. Many Indigenous researchers might be engaging in an Indigenous research methodology. Are there questions about relationality, positionality or cultural protocols? They're very important questions for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. Know yourself, know your mob, know your intention and know what might assist your community. Are there Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community members, traditional owners or elders on ethics committees? Sometimes there are, but there aren't always. What mechanisms are in place if I don't believe an ethics committee is representative enough to consider my research proposal? And would an early year career researcher like a HDR student have the courage to even ask these hard questions without fear of retribution and not getting ethics approval? We see more cultural misalignment when it comes to research, and just in general, in particular related to reciprocity and Indigenous data governance and sovereignty. So this can be widely misunderstood by ethics committees and even at the General Council level. So too often the research agreements seem to be in favour of institutions keeping the rights to research. Intellectual property rights and protecting Indigenous culture and intellectual property rights are sometimes not compatible. I can only imagine the conversation with my supervisors in the General Council when I go back to them and state the Indigenous community will own all of the outputs of the research and do with as they please. Are our institutions brave enough to cope with that? Our institutions are still very colonial in nature, and there are ongoing impacts to First Nations communities. Research backed by institutions and published in Q1 journals is still what moves this mammoth beast of a colonial machine. Is this actually helpful for our communities to be published in Q1 journals? Probably not. I mean, it's good to make government movement, but is it impactful for our communities, especially when those articles remain behind paywalls or behind institutional structures? There's also the historical trauma caused by colonisation and other cumulative impacts that we don't consider. Tokenism's a big one. Often we don't know what that looks like. You know what it's like when you're sitting on the receiving end of it, and I think people sitting on the giving end don't know what that means. Some universities include a small number of Indigenous authors or Indigenous knowledges in curriculum. This is often a little diversity in our reading list, and some students may have the same recommended text related to Indigenous knowledges for a few different units. Inclusion of Indigenous authors might be superficial. For example, a course might mention Indigenous contributions or authors without providing a deeper analysis or addressing systemic issues leading to tokenism that does not truly engage with understanding Indigenous knowledge systems. There's a fine line between finding an Indigenous resource and really having the skills to unpack Indigenous knowledges and determining whether another resource might be more appropriate. And this is something we're even struggling with at Deakin. We see in our reading list a lot of books being used across the whole sector when I know for a fact there are other books that can be used. So that'll be part of my role to go through and go, there's actually a better text and it'll give you some diversity within your reading list. So there's obviously many opportunities and a lot of this is already in process. So such as structural changes and best practices for creating inclusive environments where Indigenous knowledges and self-determination can be integrated. So we're in the process of starting to understand what Indigenous research methodologies are and understanding how this can be integrated in terms of cultural protocols and equitable changes to ethics processes. There's some universities that actually have the equitable process where you can actually have these conversations before you go through the ethics application. Other universities tell you can't even have a conversation. So some universities are way ahead than others. Collaborative partnerships, to establish genuine partnerships by ensuring that Indigenous people and communities have a leading role in setting research agendas and interpreting results. It's also great to see that institutions have graduate learning outcomes linked to embedding First Nations knowledges into curriculum. We need to think about how this works across the whole of university. Things like use of the ICAT is a really good tool that goes across the university. Also increased support for Indigenous students and researchers. So I went to university because I did a bridging course with the School of Indigenous Studies at the University of Western Australia. That's the reason I'm standing up here today. I never would have gone to university without this most amazing support network. And I can tell you that I still go back there and see people and hug them and thank them. It's probably one of the most important aspects of my life. I was just going to go work in a soil lab until my twin sister dragged me and said, over my dead body. So these support systems are really, really important for Indigenous people. My twin sister and I are the first people on both sides of our family, so Indigenous and non-Indigenous, to go to university. Obviously, the institutional changes that I recommend, that I spoke about, Indigenous strategies, increasing Indigenous employment, culture capability frameworks, and then community engagement's a big one. Often we just sort of think about community engagement in terms of research. There's a whole bunch of other areas that you can work in. I've worked with Wadawurrung traditional owners to get their seasons included in the publication that's only available for staff through a single sign-on, so that they could test whether this is something they wanted to actually put out in the local community. So we put that agreement in place as a way to educate certainly the Geelong-based staff about the seasons down there. So importantly, we have to do this in a way that we can interrogate our drive, skills, knowledge and strategy, and also interrogate institutional spaces and practices. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions if we have time.
Microphones coming around. Everyone's digesting everything. I think every time I hear you speak, I learn something new, and you always change the way that I'm about to think about things. And then your quote about rewiring our brains to view Australia through an Indigenous lens, that's exactly what it is. Are you making progress? Are we making progress? Yes?
Definitely.
Okay.
We are definitely making progress. As someone who started their PhD, got it confirmed, and then realised the ethics process was just probably a little bit too hard for me. The fact that I can do an Indigenous research methodology at an institution is proof that we are moving that way. So we are making those changes. Unfortunately, the policies sort of need to catch up. So we know that the way that we're doing it as Indigenous people are right. We just need the institutions to get on board.
Hi, Jamie.
Question.
Hi, Tui. Ruth Baxter, Melbourne Uni. Thank you so much for today's talk. You've got me thinking about digging metadata out of our archives. Where ultimately do you want that metadata to appear? Should I be aiming for Google? Should I be aiming for connecting local cultures? Obviously, both if I can, but where are people looking and are going to find it in a useful way?
Did you say where are we putting it in the metadata?
If I'm digging metadata out of the archives and putting in local language groups and that sort of information, I'm assuming you want it bigger than my uni closed catalogue.
It depends on the particular item. So some of it might be in some fields, like you obviously have some things that might be in an access protocol, or you have it in other areas that relate to kinship. So it might be in a local authority control. We have to actually add that up. IATS is a great example where they do all that adding up. I don't know how it works within the library systems. I need to mention, even though I wrote the guidelines, I'm not a metadata specialist. I sit above it. I know the basic stuff, and anyone who works with me can attest to it when my eyes just glaze over and I actually have no understanding about what people are talking about. What you need to do is really interrogate what the item is, And I guess the key thing is, how is someone who wants to access this material going to find it? And it will determine where you're going to put it. So I know people hate putting in extra notes and stuff in there, but if it's incredibly important to the record, then you just need to add it. Sorry to all those people that are cataloguers and metadata specialists out there pulling their hair out at my comment.
Other questions?
This is just a question about the ICAT trial that you did at Deakin. You mentioned something about a difference between when the ICAT was embedded within the course compared to ones that it wasn't embedded in. Did you see it? When you said that, was it embedded in terms of the teaching practice and part of the delivery, or?
So how we tested it is we recommended that they don't test it on first year students, probably try it on your third year students as a sort of, because they would have had a couple of years learning about Indigenous knowledges. And we recommended something like an annotated bibliography. And the reason for that is it gives them actually that content analysis that you're looking for, gives you the ability to understand in the bibliography whether or not they've actually understood what they're supposed to go through. And then there's all little things in relation to it, like where in the unit you're going to teach it. So one of the units we taught into was in relation to museum studies. So they actually looked at decolonial archives. So they put it right within that section about decolonial archives. Other ones were not at all. Other ones was like, we did an optometry unit. And so it really didn't have anything to do with that. But what they did find out, and it was a really interesting question back to me about optometry, is it's the little things about, we're talking about languages in Australia, and this is interesting. So in Indigenous languages in Australia, some words, some sounds have an equivalent. So the P and the B, it's the bilabial plosives basically, whether it's voiced or voiceless, the P and the B are equivalent in Indigenous languages. So the difference, there's no change in meaning. So while pig and big are equivalent in the English language, different in the English language, if that was in an Indigenous language, they'd be the same. And so the optometry person said, well, okay, so I've got a P and a B on my chart when I work with Indigenous people. And I'm like, we have to choose one. Because if the P's on the top line and the B's on the bottom. So what this did was actually gave people the ability to actually start thinking about how different it is for Indigenous people. And a lot of these people in the optometry unit actually work quite remote. So remote in the Northern Territory, where this is a very real consideration. So while it was about them trying to learn about languages, it actually unlocked this section in their brain, which is what I was talking about, rewiring your brain so you can actually understand how different it is for an Indigenous person.
Hi, Tui. I'm Juliana from University of Melbourne. You mentioned how rewiring our brains, and I really resonated with that. And I just wanted to ask, what are some practical steps, personally or as metadata specialists or in whatever vocation or role that we have, that we could facilitate that rewiring? Are there any like resources or things that you might recommend?
I guess imagine yourself as an outsider. Imagine you're going into a catalogue in France or Spain or something and you don't speak the language. And you're looking for a particular item. You might have that one word in Spanish, but you don't know the rest of it. What are you looking for as wayfinders to find that particular item? So until you understand what it's like to be an outsider, it's really difficult to actually catalogue an item from your own perspective. So you'll never be able to be an Indigenous person, but you should be able to pick up those points where, like, this doesn't make any sense to me. I don't understand what's important. You just kind of need to understand what is important. What's important for Indigenous people when we look at records is language, community, how it's connected to other family members, if it is secret and sacred. Those are the things that are important to us for us to be able to find items.
There's not any other questions. I think we can move on, and I know you'll be available today. I think people will have more questions, maybe that they don't want to ask in front of everyone. But thank you, Lucky. Thank you, Tui.
Thanks, Jamie. We now have a presentation from Roxanne Missingham, Tom Foley, Delphine Fraser from ANU, Australian National University, entitled Imagining a New Future, Adopting a New Program of Knowledge for Library Staff and Services to Achieve Greater Indigenous Knowledge in Education. Delphine Fraser is an Ngunnawal woman who has led the Indigenous project in Scholarly Information Services ANU, Library and Archives, and is a lecturer at the University of Canberra. Roxanne Missingham is currently the University Librarian ANU. She was awarded the Order of Australia for her work in libraries. And Tom Foley is Associate Director Libraries at ANU and has led the development of the Indigenous Hub. Just to note that these are short bios, just in the interest of time. For the full bios, please go online and have a look at the program there. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to start by thanking Tui for her fantastic opening keynote. That was just marvellous. To thank the organisers for a brilliant conference, to thank everyone for being here, and then to move to acknowledging that many people are joining us today from many different lands across Australia and New Zealand. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging all of the Indigenous people virtually and in this room. Pay my respect to elders past and present, and to say this is one of the most important issues, I think, for our whole profession. And there is so much work still to be done, but it's wonderful to reflect on it positively. So I'm sorry for the very long title, and like Tui, I have lots and lots of slides, but if we skip over a couple at any point, don't worry, because you'll have access to them all. So this is a presentation in 3 parts. Tom, who is joining us from Canberra, will talk in particular about the activity we built to build new discovery and access portals. Della is recorded. She can't be with us today. She's got lots on, and I will do the introduction and then the wrap up at the end. So let me just press the button. Here we go. So we did this project on the lands of the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people, and we have in the university a really strong commitment and the environment to shape a new way to work. We're the only Commonwealth institution. We were really set up for social reform. Our Vice-Chancellor talks about us having a social justice licence from the government to deliver programs, and that really contextualises the way we try to think about the contribution we can make to knowledge across Australia and across the world. For us, our real challenge, although we had always particularly looked at our collection through opportunities to increase access to Indigenous material, our real challenge happened when in December 2022, our academic board endorsed a set of graduate attributes. So ANU often does things differently. For us, rather than having a dozen graduate attributes, this is for our undergraduate students. What are the key capabilities we wish them to graduate with? We came up with only 3 graduate attributes. This one is, as you can see, insight into Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's knowledges and Indigenous people's perspectives. The second attribute was about enhancing transdisciplinary knowledge skills in all of our graduates. And the third was about critical thinking. Critical thinking we all had. That was what we did in the university. That was what we did in the library programs to support that. Transdisciplinary thinking, very complex. We've had quite a different project to contribute to that. But for the university to say Indigenous knowledge will be a part of every student's experience, no matter what discipline they're studying, was a radical change and has taken a great deal of work. We knew it was an opportunity for us to engage more broadly in the community, and the academic community was quite frankly terrified about having to incorporate this in their learning. We were also a bit terrified because it was a completely new focus, a new lens, as Tui has talked about. You have to come with different eyes to this, to say, well, how do we engage? How do we partner? How do we create a space that will support the students and the academic transformation in a time of really significant change. How do we stand up for that challenge? So we really sat down and thought about what is our unique contribution, how can we partner across every single discipline in the university, how can we change the boundaries of the way we've worked, which has been really to focus on collection access through our traditional discovery methods. And we really knew that we had to open up our knowledge, we had to open up our engagement. We had to become more confident because there was nervousness for us because we didn't think we knew enough to be able to engage properly. How would we actually then reframe and co-create knowledge in a new and different way, built on the wonderful infrastructure that was in our collections? Our real philosophy was that we had to have many hands working together. So that led us to a number of different steps on our journey that framed the presentation we're giving to you today. So we really started thinking about this with a sort of fairly traditional library lens. What is it that's the most important thing? Our people, our collections, engagement with the community and delivery to the nation. And that was the way we'd really been traditionally facing these issues, and we'd done, you know, great work like unpack within our pastoral leases information that were Indigenous wage records that we used in claims before the courts, and that had been terrific as an early learning experience, but we really knew we had to take a quite different step. We were really excited to be able to engage Delphine in this transformation as a Ngunnawal person who had actually experienced education at ANU. So we weren't looking for a traditional librarian, we were really looking for those new and different eyes. And she came on board after we'd started this project and really helped us by doing a lot of those things Tui has talked about, having conversations in a way that that was what her job was, that it wasn't something extra to put on, but we knew we needed to start with a new and different approach. So we had a number of initiatives starting off sort of fresh and with fresh eyes that I'll talk about today. We created a new way of culturally sharing and actually living within the library, shared knowledge and shared development of services. We created an Indigenous hub that Tom was the lead on, that he'll talk about, protocols for how do we actually make information about Indigenous academics available. And we had a lot of things that underpin these, some of which were existing building blocks, some of which we invested in. We did the ICIP training from Terry Jenkin Company that was wonderful. We had regular presentations from Indigenous academics and students, and the most impressive people who really took us on a journey were the students. We did the IATSIS course and had some preliminary discussions about that, but have much more to do. And we really tried to map what was our knowledge, what were the gaps, how could we do this in a supportive and a strengthening way that would bring us forward without putting too much stress on everybody. Fundamental to building that competency, building that confidence for us was having a lot of internal connections and internal conversations. For the academic community, while we engage with them, they often used places like Charles Darwin University to actually come in and give them training. And we were able to attend some of those sessions and build relationships. But we really knew that we had to listen differently to ourselves, to the community. We had to listen differently to our Indigenous partners. We had to travel on a long journey that would take us around and around and around. And we needed to look at collection use and our competencies, as well as get ready for some of the changes that Tui's talked about with ICIP. And that this would be an intense journey where we couldn't base our decision making on pre-existing knowledge. So we had to put a different knowledge framework on in order even to start this journey. Oh, did I press the right button? So one of the most fundamental things that we discovered we needed to do was not have a project plan, not have written targets that we were going to recatalogue so many records, not have all of those processes. Instead, we formed what we called a sharing circle a yarning circle methodology to bring everyone to the table, and we would have 15, 20 people in the room to talk about what we knew, what we didn't know, and to be able to practice our knowledge and our engagement in a very safe and supportive space. This was really an incredibly important opportunity for us. And do I just press the button to get Della's audio here? I just go click, you go click, I go click. It's on. I'm sure it's going to work beautifully. Do I click? Almost there, that's perfectly fine. Anyway, so just to explain, we had people from what you traditionally call technical services. We had our digital repository, so our people. We had staff who were in every single discipline area in the library. We had our archive staff. We have our map staff. And we came together to talk about what it was that we needed to know about ourselves before we were able to effectively engage with each of the colleges, each of the schools, faculties, and there was quite a lot of research that was done to try and unpick where our strengths were, and every single person behaved in a way which was different and innovative. Then they came and shared the knowledge, and for us the discovery issue as well as the content issue was as important, so that we could establish a framework where we could think through how we could partner and in an informed way with our academics who were having to make this terrifying change. It turned out to be one of the most terrific experiences I've ever really had in libraries, because everyone came with a sense of trying to do the best, and some had really our archive people had really well developed resources already to put into the conversation. Others were trying out ideas, and we were able to do several rounds of this sharing of knowledge and building our strength in order to be able to then feel that we were ready to have a conversation with the broader community. We also created a sense of being a team and being able to ask each other really dumb questions that we didn't know. So when Della's words come on, you will hear her talking about how we were treating each other very equally, and how we were participating not in a hierarchical sense, not even with a disciplinary sense, but as genuine intellectual and collegiate peers within the community. The refining that we did of our presentations, and then the presentation to our staff, was intended to make everyone feel within the whole division that they had knowledge and capabilities and knew who to go to for help when we went out to give the presentations to the academics. We're away? Go to, you press the button, I press the button? It's okay. Oh, thank you.
Yama from Ngunnawal Nation. My name is Della Fraser. Firstly, I want to acknowledge the lands that my voice will be speaking on today, the lands of the Naarm people. I acknowledge their elders past, present and future. I acknowledge their knowledge keepers and speakers. I acknowledge their survival and continuance of culture. Working with SIS staff, I found the use of yarning circles to be the best way to actually introduce and for staff to learn culture. The culture and working within culture is a learning journey. It cannot be seen as a competency or a KPI that can be ticked off. For this, I used the 4 yarning types created by VESUP. That is social yarning, therapeutic yarning, research yarning, and collaborative. The 4 types allowed us to move and make participants feel comfortable, whichever place or circle they want to be in at that time. Social and therapeutic yarning was great for the yarning circles to commence with and also make participants feel comfortable. Social yarning was a relaxed and informal, whereas therapeutic takes place where the participant tells something about themselves. And when sharing culture, this is a very important thing to undertake because it is sharing and understanding the deeper purpose. This allowed participants to understand and have an understanding of positionality, of how an Aboriginal person introduces themselves, connects to the country, and why this is important. It then allowed that the introduction of a learning circle, and with this, that culture is not linear, it is continuous, it is the foundation. The learning outcomes I wanted to achieve from this: number 1, an understanding of positionality. It was important to understand how an Aboriginal person introduces themselves, that they connect to their nation, their peoples, and their history. And that if you want to share, research or find knowledge, that this is an important foundation to start with. Number 2, why I introduced yarning circles and circular learning. That from the point number 1, that culture is not linear. It's not a start and a finish line, it is continuous. Number 3, it was important that everyone has the right to speak and that this is a safe space. And this is coming from people's own history of understanding Aboriginality. And by this, I do mean intergenerational racisms and terms that people can have. And it is starting from that foundation and moving forward. And this is where the challenge, and that there was a safe space, and that learning does have a foundation. And this is where, once again, where people were on their journey and what they were comfortable with. Number 4, understanding what is right and what is wrong and moving on forward from this. This has more so to do with the library resources themselves. Terminology was inside the books. There was a lot of learning journeys, learning curves on this. And this runs into point number 5, the confidence to continue, confidence to moving forward. That going back to point number 1 and 2, and especially number 2, the culture is not linear. There's not a start and a finish. That continuing to ask questions, continuing to open up the books, the resources, what is hidden in there, to have these conversations, but to show these resources and have them available to people. And to finish, working with the librarians at ANU, I was very privileged. Librarians are keepers of knowledge themselves. They share, they read, they recommend. So it was hard for individuals to go on this journey and start it because there are names, terminologies and definitions that are oppressive, that are colonised and are racist in sense. So it was very brave for these librarians and for the staff to move forward and to go on. Thank you for your time and enjoy the rest of your conference and of course the rest of the presentation from Roxanne. Bye.
And we couldn't, Della was just terrific. We couldn't have done it without her. So we had a number of frameworks, but what we did was different and contextual. So the next part of the presentation is Tom.
Yuma, thank you, Roxanne. Thank you, Della. I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples of the lands of where I am today, and to pay my respects to all First Australians on the lands of where we all meet, learn and share our knowledge. I particularly like to acknowledge and thank Della and recognise as well Anthony as a valuable contributor to the learning journey of many people, and myself on a personal basis as well. Roxanne and Della have outlined the path on which we have travelled in this process, and what I'll demonstrate to you here, or what I'll show, isn't an endpoint. And recognise in this process, I'm a non-Indigenous librarian working in this space, and at times that can be significantly challenging. And the methodology and the framework of the discussions that Della had put into place for myself and the staff who work at ANU was significant in not only being able to develop a resource that we can share with the university as part of its learning, but for our personal learning and our personal journey, and recognising that that is a continued process. And as librarians, and recognising that libraries are an essential part of the knowledge process of every university, indeed librarians are central to that. And what is written in our collections doesn't necessarily capture the true essence of Indigenous knowledge, but we've demonstrated that we are trying to articulate considered resources, respectful resources that have been developed through an evolution of individual cultural capacity of staff to develop a broader cultural capacity across the university. The resource that we developed has been delivered through SharePoint within the university as the first basis that the library needs to work closely with the academic staff to indeed ensure that there can be considered conversations about the appropriateness, the value, and the use of particular resources in their own teaching and their own knowledge. So that is helping the teaching staff to be able to develop and engage with Indigenous knowledges, and providing with them a source of information from the wealth of what is contained within the library collection. And Roxanne, you can move through the slides as I speak, if you're able to drive. Through this journey, it's certainly been an element that an honesty and respect in the discussions amongst staff of the resources that had been used, were continuing to be used, or were put forward to be able to be used, were aligned with the outcome of the university's graduate attribute, but also were, I'm trying to choose my words, how I say this, were considered and of value, and were able to be explained by staff through this process that the historical resources that were within the library collection can be clearly articulated by the staff who have collection and subject responsibility, and they feel the confidence that they can then engage with academic staff to have a discussion about those resources themselves. Through this, it was a development of our understanding and having the honesty of a safe space to have considered discussions as non-Indigenous librarians operating in an Indigenous space was inherently important in ensuring that there was a discussion that took place together to develop that cultural capacity. If you could jump to the next slide, please, Roxanne. Static resources are one part of what's delivered. It is the individual conversations that I mentioned that take place between teaching staff, between academics and library staff that are the key. Having a supporting resource of an Indigenous knowledges hub of curated, considered content also provides video content that is developed by subject specialists that we have shared as a group within sharing circles so that we can have discussion, commentary, that is safe to ask questions and is also safe to provide critique, because it's only through making some of those mistakes that we learn and we can understand and we can continue to develop and continue to improve. We ensured in offering content, and please do move to the next slide, Roxanne, that we provided context across the extent of the resources that form part of the archives and library collections. So that includes as well the university's own research output. This is still an evolving process, and there are many elements in terms of what was discussed this morning and what will be discussed this afternoon from peers across our learning institutions in how we undertake this practice and appropriately disseminate information, looking at those elements of metadata in the first instance, but also the inherent cultural capacity and understanding of the staff who will be able to articulate that and describe that to teaching staff and staff within the university. You just move to the next slide, please, Roxanne.
Yep.
The demonstration of the resources, and that is recognising that sometimes the material that we have in our respective collections is confronting and challenging, does take considered conversations. As much ensuring that there is an honesty in those conversations, and when we look and understand, certainly within the realm of the materials that we have within science collections, that there can be challenging conversations that need to take place. There needs to be guidance, needs to be conversations about the context, the appropriateness, and the value to ensure that not only as a entity within the university working towards a university's goal, but actually ensuring that there is a true understanding of Indigenous knowledges, the value, and being able to appropriately question some resources at different times. And Roxanne, back to you.
Thank you. So this is going to be a dynamic and living activity within the library and archives that we will continue to engage and learn from our academic peers as to what needs to happen next. One of the things that underpins our thinking at ANU Library really is the work that was led by the School of Cybernetics under Genevieve Bell, our current Vice-Chancellor, that we need to look beyond just infrastructure solutions. We really need to think about context, people, data, processes, to think holistically. And while we're really pleased that we've achieved a brilliant hub, a brilliant increase in competency of staff and greater engagement with academics and students, there are many more activities that we have planned, and we want to use this as a way of fundamentally changing the way that we're thinking, presenting our collections, and there's a whole program of activities that we'd like to be able to move on, funding and timing permitting. I wanted to conclude and leave enough time for comments and questions, because I'd really appreciate your feedback, with just summarising what we're doing in 3 different themes. For us, while we had been continuing our journey sort of slowly and steadily around understanding our collection and describing it, the challenge that was provided by this university-wide initiative of having one of 3 graduate attributes on Indigenous knowledge was a wonderful opportunity for us. And sometimes opportunities present themselves that we have no control over, but we go, oh, finally, this is a way of doing new engagement. It was an area where there was probably equal amounts of terror across the university in the teaching profession as there was in the library, but it was an opportunity for us to take a new approach. In terms of the second point, the way we went, we really took on a philosophy that we needed to do something now and that it shouldn't be overwhelmed by the sort of bureaucratic processes we normally do around projects where we write business plans and briefs and cost them and, you know, have objectives and all this sort of stuff. We took a breath, found a partner with Della, funded the project and really sought to increase the richness in the way that we culturally approached this and to take learnings that weren't just about how do we deliver something digitally, how do we change a platform. It was about how do we change ourselves, and our next challenge is to actually incorporate that new methodology in the standard sort of activities that we do, like library staff, consultative committee meetings and things like that, to genuinely take this change into our hearts and our life. My third comment, you know, as an old Queen fan, is really Queen fan. It's about we broke free. We broke free. We transformed our systems from the sort of traditional attitude that saying, well, we need to train people to use the material we have in the repository. We need to train people so they change to use things in the collection. Instead, we said to ourselves, well, what if we break the boundaries and we say, we're going to create something that is for you, we will understand your needs, we will unpack the collection completely differently with videos, with interactive means of communicating that, and we will really take a completely new and different approach to knowledge organisation. So we'll still have all of the records in catalogues and we'll do what we can do to improve those, including particularly Indigenous authors, but it was time to break free from some of the constraints that we had traditionally thought about. I did want to acknowledge that one of the reasons we could do this was because not just of the fabulous print collections that we have in our archives and library, but because of absolutely fantastic resources, and I'd particularly like to acknowledge the resources from Informit, which in law related to Indigenous studies were just amazing, and I don't think before this project we were aware of how fantastic they were. So thank you, Informit, they were just superb. So lots of challenges, lots of opportunities. Our journey has started and I think we've made some really good steps towards it, thanks to the wonderful work of a lot of people. And we have 31 seconds for comments or questions. Sorry, or we can sing Queen. Thank you.
Thanks, Roxanne. Thanks for the plug as well. That's good. Not paid, of course. I like what you said about the. I like to, change yourself before you change a platform, or on top of changing, we're going to change the platform as well. But change yourself. It's great, and also the idea of a yarning circle as a way of listening and asking questions. I'm a huge fan of the dumb question. That's one of the things that are these safe spaces and these conversations are starting to address. Any questions from everybody? Anybody?
I was nodding to you talking about the need to let go of project plans and timelines. Kylie and I were nodding away. How do you convince, or not, you might be changing yourselves the way you think about things and letting go of project plans, but if you're within a bigger organisation that runs on KPIs and they're being funded because of these KPIs, how do you start moving the bigger thing?
So I'm going to say two things. I think that's a really good question. When I was at CSIRO, when I was a younger librarian in wildlife and ecology, and we did the history, or at least I managed the project that wrote the history, the greatest achievements that the division had achieved had been called CDK projects. And CDK stood for Chief Doesn't Know. So they were things like finding enormous, fantastic genetic things because the cleaner didn't come through on a Friday. So when they came in on Monday, there was all of these discoveries to be made. So I think there is something in our creative souls about just doing it, you know, the Nike thing. I guess the other thing is because we were highly engaged and it was a university priority, there was an Indigenous academic group that we were part of that met every 6 or 8 weeks, and we would go and talk to them. We sort of treated them like our stakeholders, and we gave papers to the Teaching and Learning Committee, so everyone knew we were doing it, and they weren't asking us to do bounded things because they knew we were part of a broader social experiment, if you like, but we tried to keep engagement by being as visible as we could in a positive way, and we just didn't tell them we were changing the whole methodology at the university surreptitiously. But it'd be nice if more other areas changed as well.
Hi, I'm curious about the sharing circles. I've participated in them in my personal life, but I'm curious how staff responded to them and how it translated into the workplace.
Tom, do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, I will. Thanks for the question. I'll start at the end first, that they've been inherently valuable, and I think there's a real value in a continuation in terms of what Roxanne said. I think any element where there is a difference in approach can be maybe challenging, if not, and certainly not a resistance, but as we know that when things are different, there can be resistance at times. It was more a perhaps, and I'm speaking for myself, recognising there are other staff, perhaps a hesitation in entering something where you know that you are going to have to be vulnerable as well. And entering into something as a sharing circle is different to entering a meeting with an agenda. It's ensuring that you enter wholeheartedly. And I think that is perhaps where the challenge is, but ensuring that you have those people who are advocates and there's an honesty and a respect that is in there ensures the value of there. So that would be my comment in regards to your question.
So just the additional comment I'd make is I think just having participated in it and done a number of sessions and then seen how successful it was, I certainly, when I go into meetings when we're running them, like the Library Staff Consultative Committee, sort of put on a different hat that's not a traditional meeting hat because we've been able to practice a new methodology and it worked. It's very rewarding and that sort of builds confidence to do things and share things in a new and different way and be a bit vulnerable but also be supportive and clear.
I think that's. I think we've run out of time. Thank you, Roxanne, Tom, and Delphine out there somewhere. We're going to have a bit of a tea break now. So if everybody can come back at what is it, 11:15, if that could. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm hoping that if I just start talking, it will work as well as this morning when everyone started to sit down and listen. Sure. As we wait for everyone to come in and to regather after that nice long morning tea, I would like to introduce our next speakers. We have Naomi Mulumby, Sarah Charing, and Michelle Ruziniak to present Reflections on Indigenous Knowledges projects at the University of Melbourne. Naomi Mulumby is a faculty and school librarian with over 15 years experience in higher education. Sarah Charing is the Senior Librarian Reference Management Services in the Architecture Building and Planning Library with over 20 years experience as a liaison librarian. And Michelle Ruziniak is the Manager of Metadata and Resource Sharing at the University of Melbourne with over 20 years of experience in the metadata space. Over to you.
Thank you, Jamie, and everyone. So I'm Naomi Mulumby, and first of all, let me start by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations on the land we meet today, and at the Parkfield campus where Sarah, Michelle and I work, learn and listen. We also acknowledge the role of the Indigenous knowledges in the Academy, and at University of Melbourne that we're committed to truth-telling, being present and working together. So, can I get the next slide? Oh, I do the next slide, sorry. Okay, so this image by Lynn Onus is not just a decorative image to match the title of our presentation, it's actually an image that I have an incredibly deep attachment to. When Michelle gave us the title of this presentation, I came back into my mind's eye, and it's really an old friend to me. I first encountered this image on a tram as a schoolgirl back in the early 1990s. And back in the early 1990s, the way you encountered art was traditionally at a gallery or in books and journals, but someone in the trams department decided to put contemporary art on the trams. And I'm so thankful that they did, because it absolutely transformed my life, this image. What it says to me, and what it's to me then, was that there was something greater out there. It may just be below the surface, and I may not be able to recognise it, look at it, and understand it at the moment, but I knew there was something greater out there. And at the same time, it also revealed to me my own ignorance. So it was really a very profound thing when I used to sit on this tram as a schoolgirl and just look at this image and just think. I was completely transfixed to it. So when it's come back to me today, I think I look at it and I still think, I acknowledge I've learnt some things. I'm continually humbled by my ignorance. It's very much the beginner's mindset that Tui is talking about. When you stumble across your ignorance and you recognise it, it's quite confronting. But what is really important to me is that in those 30 years, I've learnt that being open and present is a really important, valuable thing that I can bring to this work. So last year, when Michelle gave her presentation, I was listening in online, and hello to everyone who's listening online, and I realised that while I've been doing a lot of work around Indigenous knowledge within the faculty with Sarah and other partners, and I've been doing work with CAVAL with all the Victorian libraries, what I was missing in this work was actually anything happening at Melbourne University itself. So I'm going to talk about something that's intangible. What we recognise is that people and collaboration are so important in the work in Indigenous knowledges. And at Melbourne University, because we are so big, our scale is vast, you will find that people are working on similar things to you in the next office or in the next building they have been doing for years, and you've just never ever realised. So it's about trying to build connections at Melbourne University. That's what, when Michelle was talking, I was like, okay, we have to get together and find a way to come together and talk about what's going on. So Roxanne's talk this morning with the yarning circles, obviously that's playing in my mind now. So over the last year, I can't say that we've come to an outcome, we've gone and done something, but Michelle and I and our colleague Katie from Archives have been thinking about what kind of mechanism, structure can we set up at Melbourne Uni to bring together people in cataloguing metadata. Can I call you that? Yep, okay. Archives and the liaison portfolio. Basically anyone who's a GLAM person at Melbourne University to talk about what we're actually doing in Indigenous knowledges so we can build connections. So let's move from the intangible. I'll say that this work is ongoing. Melbourne University, we do move slowly, but we are moving. I've got some head nodding over there at that table. Yep. Let's move on to what I think is really, important to talk about today, which is curation and discovery. And so Michelle's going to talk about the discovery aspect and Sarah will talk about curation. They're just one examples, or some examples of what's happening at Melbourne University. So Michelle, do you want to take it away?
Okay, thanks Naomi. So I'm going to share with you all some of the practical reparative steps we've taken to improve our metadata. I'll give a brief overview of our project that's been going on or was going on for the last few years and reflect on where we are now. I have to make sure I'm pressing the right button. So we started a project which we called the Culturally Aware Metadata Project back in June 2020. We undertook the work as we knew there were issues. Not only was there a real lack of meaningful metadata relating to Indigenous materials, the metadata that we did have came from a Western-centric and biased perspective, and a lot of it was just offensive as well. At the time we started the project, I think in 2019, 2020, there was a lot of interest within the library sector on these issues, but there was a lack of national or local guidance to help direct our efforts. Despite that, we knew we needed to do something about this. So we started by exploring the issues to get a better understanding. We looked at what others were doing locally and as well as internationally, and consulted with our colleagues in the various Indigenous centres within the university. We decided to focus on what we could realistically achieve. So as we started looking into the issues, things just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. But a lot of it was not in our understanding or within our sphere of influence to be able to change at that point. So we focused on what we could do and looked at the decisions that we could make with our current level of understanding and knowledge. Oops. So what did we do? So we developed a set of local metadata guidelines for describing materials about Indigenous peoples, languages, culture, places, Indigenous knowledges, as well as materials by Indigenous authors. As part of this, we started a retrospective cataloguing project to review and update our catalogue records. To do that, we first had to develop a search strategy that would identify the resources to be included in the project. We knew we weren't going to capture everything. We aimed at best effort because some of our records just have nothing in them that we could hook into at all, like surprisingly nothing at all. So while we were undertaking the project, we had the support of Scholarly Services Management. I think that was a real key part of us being able to progress. It also involved funding, as CAVAL helped us with some of these, a lot of actually the retrospective cataloguing project work. But there was still a lot of unanswered questions that we had. Some of those things were questions for me and my team in relation to processes and resourcing, but some of those questions required the advice of senior leaders in the university to progress. So where are we now? So the project finished last year, at the start of last year. This work is now BAU. We are using our guidelines as part of our everyday cataloguing practice. However, since we ended that retrospective project. Our metadata team has been pulled in some different directions due to workplace priorities. Our unresolved questions are still unresolved, and we have a lot more questions now, such as what do we do about problematic Dewey classifications, which was something we hadn't considered when we started out on this project. But where are we really? Reparative metadata activities, like any cataloguing projects, they can come in fits and starts depending what your staffing's like, your resources and your other work priorities. But I believe that we're still making progress in this space. Our team is better informed, and we're continuing to develop our learning, like attending events like this today. And we're much more aware within our metadata practice. So we now create better metadata records as a result. We've also been, and I think also in terms of our metadata guidelines, this is not a done deal. We are not finished with them and developing them. As we continue to learn, as we continue to think more about what we can do, those guidelines will also continue to evolve. We've also been extending the culturally aware metadata focus in small ways we can to other community groups, and have this year implemented the Homosaurus thesaurus, which is for the LGBTQI+ community. As Naomi mentioned, we're also strengthening our connections with our colleagues in scholarly services who are working in this same space, and it's been a real, I think, important part of what we've been doing over the last year. But what we think of, what we're doing in our libraries as very much particularly with cataloguing as well, we think it is very much as back of house activity. The organisational context in which we work has a huge impact on the support and progress we can make in this space. And things are changing within the University of Melbourne. So last year, the Indigenous Strategy Murmuck-Djering was released, which sets the key priorities and directions for the university for the next 5 years. The key part of this strategy is truth-telling, and as a result, they released a truth-telling book earlier this year. The book is an attempt to acknowledge and publicly address some of the very troubling and complex relationships with Indigenous Australians and the University of Melbourne. As an example, and I'll take it on a more serious note now, the book details the removal of human remains from sacred sites by University of Melbourne academics, and references photographic and other documentary evidence, papers and things like not the remains themselves. I just want to stress that are held within the University of Melbourne archives. I think this is a real key thing, like us as metadata experts and within our collecting institutions, the importance that our role can play in highlighting and bringing these resources and this evidence of past wrongdoings to light. As well as in the university, the university's recently reformed the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Cultural Heritage Oversight Committee. This opens up new avenues for us in helping us to get some answers on some of those unanswered questions like access protocols. Then broader as well in the library sector, because that also has a play on what we're able to achieve within our own local libraries. Lots has been happening within the library sector. I think the fact that we're all here today, being able to raise and discuss these issues is evidence to the increased attention and interest and all of our aims of wanting to do what we can in this space. Two of the key things for me as a metadata specialist that's arisen in the last year, one was the national guidance on metadata description, so the guidelines for First Nations collection description written by Tui. Even though she says she's not a metadata expert at all, they have been really validating for us in the work that we've been doing. When we started the project, we weren't sure whether we're getting things right or not. And while there's lots in there that we still need to delve into further, it was really affirming for us to know that we're on the right track. The other important aspect is the research data, reparative description community of practice. And shout out to my fellow co-conveners, some of who are here today, and the organisers, so Alyssa, Donna, Phoebe and Tui, and to the community members who join our meetings every month. And thanks to Alia and Accord for supporting this group. It's been incredibly valuable for us to have a forum where we can talk about the issues, share what we're all doing in a really safe and supportive space. So to provide another perspective of Melbourne activities, I'll pass you on to colleague Sarah.
Thanks, Michelle. So I'm going to talk about a more localised project here. Michelle's project really influences the entire university community. I'm going to talk about some work I did with the Architecture, Building and Planning faculty. So in June 2021, so really at the same time as all this other work was going on, I met with an academic, Hannah Robertson, who had worked in remote northeast Arnhem Land, and she had a big research interest in Indigenous place practice. And she was really focusing on decolonising the curriculum and trying to create a resource where we could incorporate Indigenous knowledges, issues and perspectives into the architecture, building and planning curriculum. So speaking with her and other colleagues in the library, we decided that we'd create a Zotero library of resources. And the next step was to hold a workshop. This is the whiteboard that was kind of the brainstorming result of that workshop. It was with a select group of researchers in the faculty who were familiar with already working with Indigenous knowledges systems. And we wanted to kind of confirm key topic areas and think about creating a structure for codifying and organising the resources. Hannah's initial ideas were to group things under Indigenous land use, caring for country, Indigenous housing and home, regional and economic development, and Indigenous culture and spirituality. But as we discussed it, we realised that each discipline area within the faculty, so we have architecture, urban planning, urban design, construction and property, everything was interlinked, so it was really hard to group things that way. So in the end, we just kept it really simple. And then the next step was to get bibliographies and other suggestions from academics working in the space. And then my colleague Sophie and I built a Zotero library starting with about 500 items, and they're all tagged with the relevant discipline area, so it's searchable. The Zotero library was great, but I was concerned that it wasn't particularly accessible. People would have to know how to find it, know how to search in Zotero for groups. A colleague of mine had made me aware of a web application called Kirko, which provides an interface which makes a Zotero library accessible and searchable via the web. So in May 2022, I applied for a Learning and Teaching Initiative grant with the Associate Dean Indigenous in the faculty as my sponsor, to support the faculty's Indigenising the curriculum strategic policy and priority. But as an academic pointed out, it's not really Indigenising the curriculum, it's decolonialising it. But the aim was to enhance the embedding of Indigenous perspectives in the learning environments of the faculty. So in August, finally, we were awarded the grant. We had to find a team to actually put this, that you can see there, into place, which was probably the hardest bit of the whole project, finding who could do it. We thought maybe a student might have the expertise. In the end, we found a team in IT that could develop it within the university's web architecture. So what you can see there is it's basically a searchable bibliography. Anyone can go in and search by topic. by keywords, and all their items are accessible kind of through links back to the university's paywalls, basically. So it's also embedded in the faculty's Indigenous engagement page, and it looks like it's being found by a lot of users outside of the university. So the total page views over its life looks quite impressive. It's really hard to tell where or who is using it. It's definitely being globally used. The largest group of users is from Singapore. I can't explain that either. I don't know why. But hopefully it means there's a lot of interest in this globally as well as locally. So it became a bit of an exemplar project. I was approached by quite a few colleagues asking how I'd done it. And one of the most significant kind of follow-up projects has been from the arts faculty team. Shout out to Peter, who's sitting over there. So their Associate Dean Indigenous got some funding to replicate the library, which you can see up there, but also what they've done is created a community on Canvas where at the moment there are 10 annotated bibliographies from the various disciplines within the arts faculty, which link into this library but provide students with more of an insight into the materials that they're using in their courses. And it's an opt-in project at the moment, so the library and faculty are actively working to encourage more schools within the faculty to engage with this and increase engagement with Indigenous knowledges, issues and perspectives by students and academic staff. I think that was my last slide. Yes, so we're looking forward to basically increasing engagement within the faculty and seeing more libraries like this rolled out across the discipline teams to really surface the knowledges and make it easier for students to engage with this area in their studies.
So just to bring it all together, when I was trying to convince these two that there was actually a talk to be given today, I was making the case that actually the small, quiet, enduring work does need to be talked about. So I think, thank you to you both for actually talking about it. It does match the themes of amplifying Indigenous knowledges. Curation discovery is gaining a lot of, well, in my head, and people I talk to, that people are saying that this is really part of the valuable work that we do in working with Indigenous knowledges. And when I have conversations with people around the place, when I listen to what they're actually saying, they're not just talking about selecting materials, they're also talking about how you present it and make it available. And that's one of those key things that we often overlook in our work, is actually the discussions we have with people about how you're going to present it. So just a couple of months ago, I was talking with a researcher who was going to do some 3D site scans of some places in far north Queensland, and he was going through building up the project, and he basically wanted the scans to be owned by the community up there. So he came to me, because I'd been doing some other work unrelated, and said to me, oh, you've got these 3D scans, how do you make them available, and can I match the community needs to this particular platform? And so we were trying to work through how you'd actually match a community to something that's defined for user types. You know, it's quite a strict kind of thought process, this 3D presentation platform. And we were talking through and trying to workshop some ideas, but also simultaneously I was talking to Michael, who is the owner, creator, I should say, of this 3D platform. And he said, oh, actually, you know, I've been toying, it's actually possible to geo-locate, restrict collections. So theoretically, we could restrict that digital collection to being only available when it's on country. And so whilst that conversation is paused for the moment, we're in the thinking stage, I just wanted to say that that role, even though it's not tangible, when we go and talk to people and talk through the implications of putting materials online, that's actually one of the key roles in providing curation discovery. Yep. So let me come back to, finally, I think Indigenous knowledge is all about the people, and when I say the people, I mean we, us here in the room and online. I think we all play a very active role, and not to undersell ourselves in that role. So thank you.
Are there any questions? No questions so far. I do have a question. Is it bad to say catalogers these days? I mean, at CAVAL, we celebrate our catalogers. So yeah, they're a very important part of what we do. I also was really happy to hear about that community of practice, the reparative cataloging community of practice, because I know last year at the symposium that was something that was discussed that didn't exist at that time. So good to hear that that's something that exists, and I know CAVAL catalogers get good value out of that too. We are going to have a quick yarn now, and I think we have a little bit more time for it because of the time that we finish now. For those in the room, we want you to gather at your tables and to discuss this, and those online, we have a Mentimeter up, all right, for discussion. You can write down on the notepads or papers in front of you if you want to discuss this. Oh, and I think we should say thank you before we go in a round of applause, sorry. I rushed on. Yeah, so the question to discuss at your table is, what actions will you take to help incorporate Indigenous authorship issues, viewpoints, and knowledges into your workplace? And you can incorporate more of what you've heard this morning into that question too, and to have your discussion. So we'll come back later. Thanks.
But it can. I think it's. Yeah. Yeah. If it go like that. Yeah, it is weird. Maybe it might be this. Check 1 2, check 1 2, check 1 2. Yeah. Yeah, it's a weird thing with them. Yeah, right.
Yeah, but now the problem is if that's muted for some reason,
Yeah.
now that that's muted, it's not going to come through the phone. So hold on.
Yeah, okay. Check 1 2, 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 check 1 2. Check 1 2, 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 check 1 2. Yeah. It might even be on the actual monitor itself.